Welcome to Plant Your Seed. I'm your host, Fred Ferris. On each episode, we share stories of how ordinary people have transformed their lives. Each story is compassionate, each story is authentic, and each story is a transformation. Here are the stories of the people who are changing our world by transitioning to a plant-based diet. Today on Plant Your Seed, joining us from New Zealand, also known as Aotearoa, we have Chris Huriwai. Chris is the co-producer of Milked, which is a topical feature documentary that exposes the whitewash of New Zealand's multi-billion-dollar dairy industry. He is a Māori vegan advocate and co-founder of the animal rights project Aotearoa Liberation League. No mai, Chris.
Kia ora, Fred. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here on Plant Your Seed. I've watched your documentary Milked, and I must say it is fantastic.
Thank you.
I learned a lot of things that I didn't know. The biggest surprise to me was that New Zealand is the biggest exporter of dairy in the world. Can you tell us exactly how the dairy industry is adversely affecting New Zealand?
Sure. So obviously, us being such a small country, that fact that you've just brought up, being the largest exporter of dairy products in the world, you can imagine such a small country being responsible for so much export. The amount of environmental toll that would have on us. And so the amount of dairy products that we produce and then export is about 95% of what we produce here in this country. And so while we're exporting all of this food, we're left behind with all of the environmental externalities. And so we see a lot of water pollution. The majority of our waterways are not fit for swimming, for example. Within farming catchments, which is about 50% of our landscape here, 80% of waterways are not fit for swimming. And so, that's where a lot of rural people live, a lot of Māori communities that, really require natural sustenance from the natural world. We rely on these natural forms of resources like our waterways for drinking water and whatnot. And so we're seeing a lot of pollution in our low socioeconomic areas. And of course, greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the sector is astronomical. Worldwide, we're used to saying, that animal agriculture produces more greenhouse gas emissions than the transport sector combined. Here in Aotearoa, the dairy industry alone produces more emissions than our transport sector. And so obviously we still have a lot of sheep, a lot of beef, deer, and other forms of animal agriculture. But the dairy industry alone is responsible for so much environmental harm. And, considering all of the other industries that is present in every other country, it's likewise here in Aotearoa. Yet we have this burdening, gigantic footprint coming out of that specific dairy sector. The environmental impacts, they're all over the place. I would need a very long amount of time to describe all the harm that's caused. But the primary issue would probably be our waterways. For me, I have a strong connection with water. I grew up next to a river called Mangatawa, and I used to be able to go to this river every day, swim in this river every day. And that's where I got my, my spiritual and environmental sustenance, being able to connect with this river, being able to swim whenever I wanted. And a lot of our people are now losing that ability to do such. And for me, that's a really harmful, negative thing, because we're going to start seeing less environmental advocates. We're going to see less children going out and connecting with the natural world. And that's going to lead to us having just a less of a connection with the natural world in the future, which is the worst thing for me.
What was the biggest thing that you learned while making the film?
The biggest thing I learned was probably, the issues are very vast and broad. There's a broad spectrum of different issues. So I guess for me, it was simply finding out that dairy is negatively affecting in such a vast degree of different spaces. Now, this was great for the film because we were able to dip into so many different pools of experts to speak to each point of difference. And, when talking to people about veganism or a plant-based lifestyle, it's nice to be able to take different approaches to getting the message through to them. So, there's obviously corruption in our political system. The dairy industry has infiltrated our education system, our health system. our indigenous rights spaces as well, through colonization. Animal agriculture was brought to this country and then used as an argument to take land from our indigenous people. Our portions of land, which the English crown saw as unproductive, they were able to confiscate that land and then, strip it and turn it into farms for animal agriculture. And so, there's just so many different spaces that the industry negatively pushes out into. So I guess if I was to pick one singular thing, it was just the fact that there is a topic for whatever perspective you have and whatever thing you're interested in, whether it's social justice or environmental justice or animal rights, that the dairy industry is pretty much at the top of the food chain in terms of what we need to be looking at to start getting a more progressive, more ethical, more sustainable society.
What is it about the dairy industry in general that you want people to know?
It's a business, We have the narratives that this is a nutritious product that our children need for bone health or for protein, or that we're feeding the world, and that this is somehow a really important and necessary industry. I mean, this is the classic argument that's used with animal agriculture in general and consuming meat. It's likewise here with dairy, but it is supercharged because it's the backbone of our economy, because of all the environmental devastation that we're seeing from the industry. It's trying to justify itself as much as possible. It's digging in its claws as deep as it can, and particularly here in Aotearoa, trying to embed itself into the landscape here and make arguments that it's now a part of our identity, a part of our culture. And so there's a lot of manipulation going on by the industry. There's a lot of greenwashing. There's a lot of propaganda, they're trying to corrupt the mindsets of our people. And so not only is it an unhealthy product that's unnecessary that we don't need, but it's doing it in a disingenuous way, trying to manipulate us into supporting something that is indeed killing us and, of course, killing millions of animals and destroying our environment.
Is New Zealand polluted with nitrates from fertilizers beyond a safe threshold?
Definitely. We have a huge amount, we use a huge amount of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer because, obviously we want the grass to grow, so we have to pour fertilizer on. A lot of this fertilizer is not taken up by the grass. It's washed away in the rain, or it leaks out through the cow's urine. And like I said, with the water pollution, this seeps into our waterways and creates unswimmable rivers and also undrinkable drinking water. And so, nitrates is a real problem. One of the big problems with nitrates is that it's invisible. You can't see it. And so what might look like a healthy waterway, to the untrained eye, could potentially be a waterway so polluted that you couldn't even have your dogs drink from it, for example. In terms of nitrate contamination of drinking water, we're looking at about 800,000 people who could be negatively affected. And, we've got a population of around 5 million people here in Aotearoa. So that's about a fifth of the population who's being negatively affected just through nitrate contamination. So, I'm talking about one small part of the industry, whereas, there are many things that environmentally affect us. But just from this one small aspect of the dairy industry, one aspect within this industry, a fifth of our population are being negatively affected by this nitrate contamination. So it's a huge issue, and there's a lot of other things for us to worry about. So, this is definitely one we need to find a solution to.
Now, one of the solutions that was put forth in the film is growing hemp because it absorbs nitrogen so well. Can you explain how hemp might be a solution while oats, say, cannot?
Sure. You need to cycle your crops, right? When we talk about regenerative agriculture, we need to look at certain crops that can be put into a cycle. So oat farming is great, but you're going to need legumes and other nitrogen-fixing plants to mix in with the rotation of your crops. And particularly what is good for here in Aotearoa, for dairy farmers, hemp would be an incredible transition crop or diversification crop. The road to transitioning our farmers out of this industry is going to be a long one. And so potentially what could be used to lower nitrate contamination and to fix nitrogen so that we use less fertilizer would be to cycle a dairy production system with planting hemp. Yes, it can be used as a product in and of itself to potentially sell and be used as an alternative product for transitioning, but simply the nitrogen fixing aspect of a rotational crop in a dairy system, as well as with hemp's ability to sequester a lot of carbon. It's not just about nitrogen fixing. It's an incredible crop for cleaning up the environment. And so while we have this incredibly dirty industry that we are trying to transition out of, it really would be a miracle, perfect crop for farmers. But we see a lot of issues because it's a cousin of the marijuana plant, and so there's a lot of legislation, a lot of barriers for legitimizing this plant. Working it into a system that will give our farmers sequestration credits, for example, for them to earn extra money through the carbon that can be sequestered from hemp. But because, of course, the stigmatization of marijuana and in turn hemp as well, there are those barriers that we need to work through until our farmers can use it as a tool.
Now, you mentioned supporting farmers in a transition away from dairy. How can we do that?
Well, I think it's just about changing how we talk about things. When I became vegan and became an animal rights advocate and environmental advocate, I used to just, I guess, how can I say this? I wasn't very kind to farmers, but through filming Milked, I realized that a lot of our farmers are indebted into the system. They've taken out loans, they're in the negative, and for them to be able to transition it's a very long and hard pathway. And so for me, something that needs to change is we need to work with everybody. We need to be compassionate, and we need to think about time frames and transition pathways that actually works for everyone. And in terms of us as individuals, what we can do, really what this comes down to is being politically minded, staying up to task with which politicians are putting through the right pieces of legislation and supporting the right pieces of legislation. And for when it comes time for us to help these groups, we need to be active. We need to be in our social groups where we have the most influence to be open to talking to our friends and family, to remind them of political actions that are coming up. And group rallies that are happening in their town, outside local council buildings, outside Parliament, but using a compassionate narrative when we talk about our farmers instead of just demonizing them, because often it's lack of industry leadership that's led them to where they are, and just like the environment needs help, just like our animals need help, our farmers actually need help as well.
How can we reduce the demand for dairy products?
Well, something that I'm working on, for example, is the nutrition guidelines. Our nutrition guidelines are impacted by industry influence. In Canada, for example, they removed industry influence and just based their guidelines off of straight science. And then we saw, less glamorization of dairy products. And so, again, it's about being politically minded, understanding how systems work, giving feedback when drafting processes are taking place, having meetings with your local politicians and councillors, just to normalize a plant-based diet or a vegan way of living. We need to get dairy out of our schools, out of our healthcare system. We need to have doctors making adequate recommendations and adequately identifying issues that are related to animal product consumption. For me, it just comes back to talking compassionately about these things. Obviously, we understand the urgency around the need for this. Once we can lower the demand, we're gonna see a lowering of production, and then through a lowering of production, we're going to see a lowering of environmental harm and animal cruelty. And so, of course, there's the urgency, but like a lot of things in our world, we have to be patient, and we have to engage in a way that's bringing everyone else along with us. And so I think particularly one thing that I've learned as an activist is in my early days, I was very reactionary. And, I was probably trying my hardest to get out on the street and shout at somebody, But the more I dig into this aspect of our society, the more I'm learning that we need to sometimes just live by example and live as positively as we can and help that our influence stretches out to those who are closest to us, and then to keep those conversations going in our communities and then work from there.
Māori are born the guardians or Kaitiaki.
Kaitiaki.
How do you feel about this responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I feel personally a responsibility to enable my whanaunga, my wider Māori whānau, to take up that responsibility of being Kaitiaki. To be a Kaitiaki means to be a steward of the land, someone who looks after this existence which sustains all of us. A Kaitiaki is someone who nurtures the mauri, the energy that exists between, Rangi Nui Papatuanuku, our Sky Father and our Earth Mother. A Kaitiaki nurtures that energy that exists between all of us that gives us life. And those are narratives and stories and, beliefs that I've had instilled in me. Unfortunately, a lot of us have lost connection with those stories and those perspectives and those understandings of responsibilities. But there is a need for, not just for Māori, but for indigenous perspectives and ways of relating with the natural world to be bolstered and highlighted and returned to, because those more kinder natural ways of relating with the natural world are direly in need right now. But yeah, through colonization and the disconnection of Māori people and indigenous people with their own indigenous practices and indigenous stories of relating to the world, there is now a huge need, and I feel burden on my shoulders to empower my people to return to this mantle, to this role, this tūranga waiwai, this place where we can speak proudly and strongly to our stories of indigenous ways of relating to the natural world. It's a long, hard road. We're minorities, but I think I've been really encouraged in recent years. Things like the indigenous rights of indigenous communities worldwide being more recognized. Here in Aotearoa, we're on a bit of a pathway, I would say, to more adequately give respect and notoriety to indigenous ways of relating. But yeah, it's a long and hard road. We've got a long way to go, but it's something I'm very passionate about.
Can you tell us about the Aotearoa Liberation League?
Yep, Aotearoa Liberation League. This is a joint project between me and my partner, and primarily what we like to draw attention to is the fact that, pre-colonial times, for Māori here in Aotearoa, we had no animal agriculture. There were no sheep, there were no cows. Those were all introduced animals which came, around 200 years ago. But now, these industries are leading our country. When the British colonized Aotearoa, they did it because they needed more land for their energy-consuming industries such as animal agriculture. They needed more water. They needed more space. And so we've seen here in Aotearoa animal agriculture used as a tool to further colonize this country. There were legislations put in place to remove what the Crown considered to be unproductive parcels of land, which allowed the Crown to take that land from Māori and then farm it for what the Crown viewed to be a useful use of the land. But for Māori, of course, they would have seen that land is a forest. It's a wetland. It's a natural ecosystem. It doesn't need to have a specific monetary, financial benefit to us. It's existing in its natural state, and that's its purpose, and the benefits that we get from it are clear through the healthy environment that it provides. And so these links between colonialism and animal agriculture and the benefits of veganism and a non-violent way of existing are things that we try to highlight and encourage through our project, Aotearoa Liberation League.
Now, you mentioned the land. How does rewilding the land with native species actually help New Zealand?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing here in Aotearoa is the growth of pine tree plantations. We're switching from dairy cows to pine trees to turn into carbon sequestration farms, and we're selling those carbon credits to different countries. But and I'm not an expert on pine trees, but from the advice that I've received, pine trees are not the greatest thing in terms of increasing biodiversity. I mean, at the end of the day, a pine tree plantation, it's a monocrop. One of the reasons why dairy farming is so bad is because it's a monocrop of ryegrass. And so the lack of biodiversity because of a monocrop, we're seeing similar issues with pine tree plantations. And so once our farmers transition into more sustainable land use practices, and hopefully we're using less land to produce more food through horticulture, the land that we gain back after that transition, it needs to be used responsibly. It needs to be used to suit this landscape here in Aotearoa. So it makes sense to encourage the planting of indigenous native species. And we've got statistics to show us that a well-matured native forest sequesters more carbon and, of course, has higher levels of biodiversity than a pine tree plantation. So in terms of our route and goal for transitioning, once we have achieved that transition, we just need to make sure that we use that opportunity to build the best possible foundation for us moving into the future instead of wasting that opportunity.
Now, getting back to the film, you mentioned in the film the Rethink X Report, making dairy without cows, which will wipe out the global dairy industry by 2030, which is just about 8 years. Is this feasible and possible?
Well, it's one of those things, when we look back and we think about iPhones or computers or cars, technology changes very, very quickly. And so from the projections of Rethink X, all things going according to plan, their prediction is, it's very bold. And I guess the message is that this is possible and it will have real world implications. And so, as we say in the film, who knows if it's going to get there within that time frame, but it definitely will get there. It is literally just a matter of time. It is on the horizon, and because of its potential, our farmers, our governments, people who are deep within the industry of animal agriculture, particularly dairy as a commodity good. Here in Aotearoa, it's milk powder, just absolute commodity, which will be the most easy product to replace. So we're really vulnerable to precision fermentation and this disruptive new way of producing dairy protein. Because it's possible, we really need to be acting with haste to find alternatives and to transition our farmers, because the real world implications, if this technology comes through, is that a lot of our farmers who are indebted into the system are going to be left behind. They're going to be, we kind of see them as the economic heroes at the moment, but once this disruption comes through, they're going to be left behind with a whole bunch of infrastructure, cows, unprofitable land because of the pollution of fertilizers that they've been using. We need to be more forward thinking, because these people, our farmers, they're really going to be left behind.
In the documentary, you mentioned cowspiracy having a major influence on you. How and when did you transition to a plant-based diet?
Yeah, big influence with cowspiracy. If people have seen Cowspiracy and then they watch Milked, I'm sure they'll see a lot of similarities. I mean, it's a great film. a great way of presenting information. And just a big thank you to Keegan Kuhn, who actually became our executive producer and did the music for Milked. So big thank you to Keegan. He's an amazing person. For me, going vegan, I mean, I first went vegetarian when I was 13 years old. And it was about 10 years after that I made the transition to vegan after watching the documentary Earthlings. So obviously documentaries have had a great influence in my life, and what a privilege it's been to be able to now work on one which will hopefully have that same impact on other people. But yeah, besides watching Earthlings, things that helped me along my journey was I grew up on a lifestyle block. I was homeschooled and had a lot of animals, so I was able to spend a lot of time with animals and with the natural world. Like I said, my riverway, my waterway, my Mangatoa. I had a supportive mother as well. When I went vegetarian, she always would make sure that I would have a meal. She sometimes cook two meals. There'd be the meat-based one, and then there would be the vegetarian one for me as well. So I was very lucky to have that support within my family. I was just in a good space and time in my life. After 10 years of being a vegetarian, I was reflecting on myself and what I could do to live more aligned with my values and principles. I heard about this documentary Earthlings, and after I saw it, I just thought, wow, I don't want to, even the slightest way be contributing to this mass degree of suffering. So I had to make the switch.
What is it about your values that was so important to you to make that switch?
Well, when I was a vegetarian, I enjoyed the thought that animals were not dying for my food, for me to sustain myself, that I didn't have to kill anyone else. And obviously, as a vegetarian, when you get to know the egg industry and the dairy industry, the amount of animals that suffer through those systems, and then at the end of their exploitation are killed because they're not, respected to be retired somewhere. They're just commodities, so we kill them, and then people that consume meat will do away with them that way, or we'll use them for fertilizer. So, I've always called myself an animal lover. I've always considered my relationship with the environment to be, something that I really cherish and that I'm proud of. And I've always gained my nourishment, my spiritual nourishment, and my hauora, my well-being through my understanding of my connection to the natural world. And so after I learned about all these other industries that are harming, abusing, and disrespecting animals and the environment, for it to be laid out to me in a documentary like that, as hard-hitting as Earthlings, it just made it abundantly clear that if I really resonated with these values of non-violence, of environmental sustainability, of justice, and of peace, that I needed to really become that and to take that further step to become vegan.
What changes did you see both mentally and physically, if any, after going vegan?
Yeah, definitely mental changes. I was already quite a healthy individual. I was an athlete in my younger years. I mean, I still like to call myself one, but I've been a bit lazy recently, to be quite honest. When I was younger, I got into a sport called extreme unicycling, which will sound very uncommon, and it is. But this sport took me around the world, and I competed internationally, had world championships and things like that. And so physically, I was already quite healthy, and I looked after myself. I like to think. I think the energy gain that I got through going vegan was primarily from the mental aspect of me then feeling more living in alignment, and I felt less burdened, less encumbered, knowing that I was no longer contributing to this huge degree of suffering. It's hard for me to look back and pass out if it was a mental or a physical difference. But I definitely felt better, and whether or not that was something physical that was happening through nutrition or mental, hard for me to say. But I can definitely say that I lived a more happy, content, and peaceful lifestyle once I made the switch.
How do you go from being a 3-time world champion street unicyclist to producing a documentary?
Absolutely, it's a good question. I have to give the full credit in terms of the production side to our director and producer, Amy Taylor. I was definitely more front of camera, helping with script and research as well, and the story of the film, and just interview questions and things like that. But yeah, I came off the back of extreme sports and being a really outgoing person and like, goal setter, a real go-getter, I guess you could say, in terms of what I wanted to achieve. And so when I became a vegan and then an advocate for this lifestyle, I put myself out there and I started doing activism kind of from the get-go. I went to there was a health expo happening in my town, and I thought I have to be there. Simply through what I've just learned with veganism, I have to share this information with people. So I dived right in there. And then after that, I started getting into street activism, interviewing people on the street, doing street actions. And then I moved into social media and making videos. And the first video that I made that got a lot of attention was a video about Fonterra and a program that they ran in schools, giving away free milk in schools. And so I was also working in schools at the time, teaching my sport, unicycling, to kids in schools, which was a great, amazing job. It's an incredible thing working with children. And so, I would see them with their milk cartons in school, and, they would tell me, that, oh, yes, the teacher tells us that milk's good for strong bones and yada, yada, yada. And so I had I had a fire in my belly, to start speaking out against all of this propaganda that our children are being conflicted with and being faced with. And Fonterra saw my video, reached out to me, tried to engage with me, but I wouldn't say very genuinely, because when I got back to them, they disengaged. I guess they could see how serious I was in terms of wanting to get answers out of them, and so they stopped their engagement with me. And Amy, she saw my video that I put out on social media. She heard about me. We worked on some smaller projects together. We've made a short film together. But then, during that project of creating another short film, we started talking about an Aotearoa version of Cowspiracy, and one that highlighted these issues within the dairy industry. So we just connected. She's vegan as well. We're both in that advocacy space for veganism. Her handling the filmmaking production side, and for me to do a lot of the other stuff.
Now, did you ever struggle with anything when you first became vegan, like eating out with friends or just hanging out with people?
Yeah, I mean, so I was already vegetarian for 10 years, so I faced a lot of that already. But it's an extra step when you go vegan, definitely. There's mayonnaise and dairy and cheese on everything, so eating out was a little bit more difficult, but because of my conviction and my appreciation of animals and not wanting to contribute, all of those inconveniences and hindrances melted away every time I reminded myself of my why. And that's what I tell people, to always hold on to your why. But social occasions can be difficult, like at a work function, for example, and you always got to tell them beforehand. Otherwise, it's going to be a potentially really awkward scenario. I arrived somewhere once, and they were kind of putting on an event for me, essentially like an appreciation event for me, and I forgot to let them know that I was vegan. I kind of, I thought maybe they knew. Anyway, I get there and they're all celebrating, and I can't even consume, like the cake and a few things, and so that made a very awkward situation. So advice for everybody out there: if you're going anywhere, if you're socially anxious, of course, give people a heads up. Here in Aotearoa, we call it manakitanga, which is like hospitality essentially. And manakitanga, it's best when you give your host the appropriate opportunity to be a good host, and so it's easy to avoid some of those awkward social situations if you give a heads up, or if you bring your own food with you and you can share it with everybody else. That's the best thing. But some falling outs with friends and family. I like to think I've rebuilt a lot of those bridges. In my early days of being a vegan, I think I was a bit more of a reactive, angry vegan. I do like to say that, it brought me a lot of mental peace and whatnot. But, obviously there are those times when the burden of animals really gets you down and, things can get emotional. So that manifested itself with me, had some kind of, hairy conversations with some of my family members. But yeah, we've worked through it and rebuilt bridges and, moving on with life now, trying to reconnect as much as I can.
What is it about Aotearoa that makes you so passionate?
It's where I'm from. So, I like to believe that everyone should be proud of where they're from. But I'm particularly motivated, I suppose, because I feel like Aotearoa, my people, Māori people, we've really, drawn the short straw. The values within Māori culture, I think, are ones that the world really needs today. But through, manipulation, capitalism, greed, colonization, our ability to really have a strong influence in the global state of things is really diminished because we've been disempowered by those who have colonized us. And so, I'm proud of Aotearoa because this is where I'm from. But also, I really, truly believe that our ways of doing things and indigenous practices really hold a lot of benefits for our global society.
Besides the film, what is one thing that's really exciting you in your life right now?
I'm coming into a really exciting space in my life. Me and my partner are talking about marriage. We're talking about building a house, children. I'm 30 years old now, so I feel like I've come into a new space in my being. I'm thinking a lot more about nutrition for myself. I'm doing yoga. Look at that, stretching a lot more, and just being a little bit more holistic with my health. And I've slowed down a bit in terms of my activism around how I said I used to be reactionary and act a little bit hastily. I feel like I've got a lot more patience now, and I'm understanding that more patience will come as I get older. Although of course we have the climate crisis, we have trillions of animals suffering. There are so many things to get upset about, but I feel I'm coming into a new pace, a new, more sustainable pace with my activism and how I carry myself, which feels like a heavy weight being lifted. And that's probably being mixed in with the fact that we've finally been able to get this documentary out, which has taken around 3 years. So, the completion of this documentary and feeling like I'm coming into a new chapter in my life is a really euphoric feeling for me at the moment. I just sit with it sometimes and appreciate it. The last few months have been really great. Moving on from Milked, I'm able to focus on Aotearoa Liberation League, which draws in more of my indigenous identity and identity as a Māori man in Aotearoa, and I'm able to speak a little bit more to racial inequality, which is prevalent here in Aotearoa, despite everyone talking about how much they love Māori culture and how beautiful our culture is. It is quite a racist country, unfortunately. It is a country, a colonial country built off colonizing my people, and so there's a lot of work to do within that space. And now that the documentary is finished, I'm happy that I'll have a bit more energy to contribute more, especially on a local level, to work a little bit more with my community, to get a little bit more embedded into my community. It's a very small one, but with more free time, looking forward to engaging a lot more. But of course, at the end of the day, I am an animal rights advocate. And often when I talk about race issues and colonization and things like that, I always feel that people, are sad that I'm not strictly talking about animals, but this is a part of who I am. Race-related issues affect me daily, and so not only do I think it's important to talk about race-related issues and racism simply because it's the ethical thing to do, but it is simply inherently around who I am. And so these are conversations that I don't have the privilege of straying away from. They're literally a part of my being. So that's one thing I'm excited about in terms of being able to contribute more into that space. But while remaining a vegan and animal rights advocate and taking those stories for animals into those spaces so that we can all grow together.
Where did you get the courage to start the film?
Well, I think when Amy first brought about this idea of the film, we kind of just joked at each other. We just laughed it off, I think. But she's a filmmaker. She's a great filmmaker, and I guess, I mean, I have to give her the credit for that one. She would have encouraged me, and she would have, made that promise that she's going to bring it home, and she did. She really brought this film home. She's been the driving force from the get-go. I'm very proud of my contributions, but yeah, in terms of having the courage and the ability to create this film, that's Amy Taylor.
What is one habit or hack or tip that helps you stay on track with your plant-based diet? Earlier, you mentioned your why.
Sure, yeah. I mean, holding on to that why for me will always be the key at the end of the day. I mean, I could eat just rice and beans every single day, because for me, it's all about the animals. But get a good routine. It's not just about your diet, I suppose. If you're trying to go vegan or to sustain a plant-based diet, you're only going to be able to make those lifestyle changes and build those habits that you're trying to build if you're happy, doing something like that, doing something that is altering your lifestyle and sustaining it is a very difficult thing to do if you don't have adequate support and if you're not kind of content and at peace with your pathway in your own life. And so I guess I would say maintain your hobbies, which keep you happy, maintain your relationships, which, keep you healthy, and find support. If you're ever struggling, find support, find those friend groups, find those social communities online. If you don't have friends and family to lean on in person, there's worlds online of people that are willing to support people through these lifestyle shifts. But keep doing what makes you happy. Because if you're trying to introduce lifestyle changes, you need to be looking after yourself holistically.
Finally, can you give me one word to describe how you felt before you were vegan and one word to describe how you feel now that you are vegan?
Yeah, one word before I was vegan, conflicted. And after I was vegan, I mean, it sounds a little bit grandiose, but to be honest, I felt enlightened. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to come across as someone who's sounds like they've, found the light or, like I'm born again or something, but just the ability to go vegan and to feel that understanding of why was incredibly empowering. I have so much love for animals and for the environment, and to see this industry or this way of living consuming animals which harms it so negatively, and then to be able to make that decision to remove myself from that negative contribution just felt so incredibly empowering, because so many things in our lives, we don't have control over them. But of course, we have control over what goes in our bodies and what we eat. And so to reclaim that right, that responsibility to remove myself from such a negative system, reminded me that that I can have influence, that I can make some form of change, even if it's just for myself. But I think within ourselves is a very important and special place to start from if you're wanting to make global change. For me, it does start with the individual and what we do ourselves. And so to be able to do that was incredibly empowering, uplifting, and enlightening for me.
It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. What is the best way for people to watch the documentary Milked and to follow you on social media?
Oh, it's been great having a chat with you, Fred. It's just been nice being able to reflect on my own values for a little bit, actually. It's not something I too often talk about, so this has been really lovely. Watching the film, our website is milked.film, and you'll find the full film on the Water Bear app. It's a streaming platform primarily focused on environmental documentaries, and as well a little bit more accessible because you don't have to get an app. We've also got the film on the Plant-Based News YouTube channel. And it's all completely free, and we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. We've got subtitles on the YouTube version, and we're working on some foreign subtitles at the moment. And of course, if there's anyone out there that wants to help contributing to foreign subtitles, please get in touch on our website. And if people want to follow me, Aotearoa Liberation League is on Facebook and Instagram. And we also have our website, which is all.org.nz. And would love to have people's support on that platform as I continue my activism journey, talking as broadly as I possibly can about the benefits of non-violence, particularly looking at the relationship between colonialism, animal agriculture, and veganism.
Thanks again, Ngā mihi, Chris, for being on Plant Your Seed.
Of course. Thank you, Fred. Kia ora koutou.
Hope you are inspired by this story, and remember, it's never too late to plant your seed. Links to everything we talked about on the podcast can be found on Instagram at plant.yourseed in the show notes tab in the bio. If you enjoyed the show, remember to leave us a review, and until next time, thank you for listening.